Hi, and welcome to Spin Nation. We are the data driven podcast that reveals the forces shaping Canadian perspectives. I'm your host, Laurel Osfield. Welcome to my co host, Emmanuel.
Hi, Laurel.
Hi. So, we are doing this podcast. This is our second episode. We are always looking at the conversations that are political, social, cultural, or economic from groups that are vying for the attention of Canadians, wanting to shape what we see, we hear, we believe. And we wanted to break all that down, bring it into podcast form for the people who are interested in the strategies and the numbers behind all the spin. So if you're interested in that, this is your podcast. So here we are, episode 2. We're going to talk about echo chambers. Emmanuel, what do we want to know about echo chambers?
So people on the left and the right are complaining that no one is listening to their point of view. And a lot of the news media has been blaming social media and some of the big tech companies and the algorithms for the divisions that have been created as a result of that. So my question to you, these echo chambers, are they real? And what should we do about them?
Well, I don't have all the answers, but what I would like to do today is share some of the research that we looked into. Now, here at 96 Advisors, and for this podcast, sometimes we'll do our own analysis, but we also will use analysis from a lot of companies, organizations out there who've already done the heavy lifting, that have done good work. Well, of course, we cite and we can put links in the show notes for people who want to look at it themselves. But to start with, first off, there's not a lot of data about Canada specifically on this topic of echo chambers. Most of the data has been, the research has been done around the United States market. So we're going to take some US data. We'll take it with a grain of salt, knowing that we are not the same, but I think enough cultural similarities that we can draw some parallels. But first, Pew Research, they looked at this question, and it was coming out of whether or not people think social media overall is good for democracy. And they looked at, I want to say 15, 20 different countries. Now, Canada was actually evenly split. So the number of Canadians who think social media is good for democracy was about 49%, and 47% think it is bad. So I think we can kind of extrapolate a bit that there's this perception in Canada that social platforms, they bear some of this responsibility. So is it right to think that way? I don't know. I think we need to understand a little bit deeper. So obviously that this perception exists that social media has some culpability here within Canada. And these numbers differ greatly between developed and undeveloped countries. If you're interested, go check out this Pew Research. We can put that in the show notes for people. When you look a little more at, is the algorithm responsible? What I have seen at looking some of the different research out there is it's very difficult to extrapolate between how much is the responsibility of the algorithm and how much of this is human nature.
Right, because people like to listen to a topic and they'll just naturally listen to more news on the same topic. So is it the algorithm or is it just interest in a particular topic?
Right. And when you're doing or you're trying to do academic research, you're trying to find out, is there, the correlation or causation? It's hard. A lot of these researchers saying it was very hard to actually solve for that problem. And I think a lot of us have had that thoughts ourselves when we're scrolling at things you might be interested in a topic and you're hesitant to click because you don't want to mess with your algorithm, right? I literally been with people and said, oh, look this up, and people say, I don't want to because I don't want it to mess with my algorithm. So one piece of work that I did find was the Brookings Institute. They did a 2024 YouTube study. Again, this is the United States. There is nothing I could find for Canada. If any of our listeners have Canadian data they want to share, please send it our way. We'd love to see it. So they tried to solve for this chicken or egg challenge. And what they found, so I'm not going to go into everything they did specifically on trying to solve for it. They did make this effort. but it's sort of mixed. They did find that there was a moderate push to the right, regardless of a user's political leaning.
And that matches some other research that I've read, and I'll put it in the show links. But they started with fresh, brand new accounts. This was in Europe, and followed 4 or 5 political leaders, and then based on that, look to see if the recommendations for the future content was more to the right or more to the left of those candidates that they followed. And I think similar finding to your research, the same thing, a slight lean to the right, but nothing particularly massive.
And I did look at a meta study. What actually found that that it's actually mixed, and it very much depended in terms of who the researchers were, the questions they were asking, and their methodology. Some found there was a clear, the algorithm was definitely pushing people into a right wing rabbit hole. Others, I think, found if it was more of a content approach, this wasn't the case. Talking about rabbit holes, the Brookings Institute research that I referenced, they found that a very small percent went down a rabbit hole. So there's a difference between getting nudged a little bit or being served a little bit more content versus really going deep. And so they made a distinction between these two. And they found that it was in a very rare occurrence that people were sent deep into a rabbit hole. Is that relevant or not, I guess, is the question.
Yeah.
That depends who's the person going down the rabbit hole.
I think what probably scares people the most is all of these algorithms are a black box. We know there are state sponsored actors that are pushing their own content. Is it successful or not? Well, we just don't know. There's been a lot of studies of the Trump won election, and I think the general outtake of that was that the Russians did influence the election, but they weren't necessarily trying to get one candidate or the other elected. They just wanted to enhance the conflict and the controversy around it. So I think that's what we're seeing a lot of the time is a reaction to the fact that we just don't know how these algorithms work, and that can be a scary thing. Media in Canada in particular used to be a protected industry, and we knew who the investors were in a lot of the media networks, and that brought some sort of certainty. But now we don't know who's going to influence a story. One thing that we've noticed, we did some research a little earlier about Alberta separatism. And one thing that we found was that not only was it a Canadian conversation, but there were people from the United States, some really high influence individuals that were chiming into the topic, and they were bringing it to the attention not just of their international audience, but to that Canadian audience that follows those US influencers. So we just don't know who's pulling the different strings, and between the algorithm and the natural influence of certain groups, who is it that is really promoting a particular point of view?
There's that black box element. There's also that human element of just choosing what you want to look at. I mean, personally, when I'm on my TikTok, I am careful not to spend too much time on certain TikToks that are fed to me that I don't want more of. So I'm trying to tell the algorithm flip, flip, fast, like swipe, swipe, swipe pretty fast so that it learns I'm not interested in this topic and it'll start to feed me something else. I think people are curating their algorithms more. So again, this human intervention aspect does play a very important role. In some cases, I think TikTok's probably the best at feeding you what you're telling it you want to see more of. Uh, but also, as I said, it might mean that you don't click on things because you don't want the algorithm to learn or get any indication that you want more of that, because maybe you're just interested, but you don't want to spend too much time on it. It's a very kind of challenging space to understand. But I think the other thing we haven't touched on yet, which you and I have talked a fair bit about in around the kitchen table, is the fact that people are self-selecting into certain channels that can reinforce an echo chamber. The clear best example of that is on X, where it is becoming a much more strongly right wing channel because there was an escape, the flying away of a lot of those more progressive voices and move to Blue Sky because they felt that X was, not a safe, quote unquote, safe place for them anymore.
Yeah. And obviously driven by some of Elon Musk's own political leanings and possibly reinforcing of the algorithm. So all of that has generated quite a change where Twitter used to be sort of a left leaning addressed to an audience that of reporters. A lot of the reporters were getting their news there, and now it's flipped completely to the other side of the spectrum. Now that it's X,
Right. And the introduction of the For You page on X as well has changed things a lot there.
yeah, I tried to avoid that place.
I spend time on there. It does feed me things I would otherwise not see, but sometimes there are things I just don't want to see.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to take the good with the bad, I expect. Now, I want to talk a bit about who's pushing this narrative that social media algorithms are something we need to worry about and echo chambers are scary.
Well, I think there's two things happening. There's fragmentation of the media sphere, and actually, what we're observing right now is the emergence of a lot of new voices that are talking about new topics. And so, on the one hand, that's happening, and so some of the larger audiences are being fragmented. But at the other end of the spectrum, I think there's been a reaction to a lot of the information desert during or following. I'm not sure if desert is the right name, but the information control following COVID and some of the restrictions and what people were allowed to publish or not. And there's been a reaction, possibly an overreaction from the right in particular, saying that their voices have been shuttered.
I remember that now. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it matches some of the information that we shared on our first podcast, where trust in media has dropped significantly, but in particular with the right wing conservative arm of audiences. Left leaning audiences still trust, in particular, mainstream media at high levels of engagement, but it's dropped significantly in the last few years for the right wing.
I definitely see this is being picked up by a lot of academics and researchers and think tanks. So they're behind the actual some of these studies and research. But I just say media loves a story.
Media loves
For
to talk about itself.
Well, it does love to talk about itself, but I also, the social media platforms are their big competitor. Also their big channel, but also the big competitor for the ad dollars. So I think they like any chance they get or any research that they see to say, oh, it's dangerous over there. Don't go look over there. It's dangerous. I think they have a built-in bias on wanting to promote those stories.
Well, everybody is trying to, build their audience, just like we are. So obviously, you want to try to promote these messages.
That's right. Okay, so you know, so what? All right, so we've got these platforms may or may not be feeding us a certain amount of content. What's your so what with this?
Well, the so what is this a problem? Is this a problem for Canadian unity, for example? As Canadians, do we need to be worried that somehow there's two different audiences being created and that they don't speak to each other? Um, I'm a little bit concerned about that. One of the conservative leaders' tactics in this election was not to speak to the mainstream media and not do interviews and focus exclusively on the right leaning and emerging media. So that concerns me a little bit if it becomes a tactic. I actually think both sides of the aisle need to reinforce the communications that they have with the other side. And that's done through the media that people consume. A lot of folks have been complaining or just saying that, traditional media is losing audiences. That might be true, but if you need to engage with the older cohorts, the boomers, then you need to engage on the channels they're on. And that's still linear TV and a lot of the traditional media news. And
That's
vice versa. We've got an emerging Like if you look at any statistics, the younger generations, the alpha or whatever comes after alpha, they're using YouTube for a lot of their news gathering. So that's where you need to engage with them.
And that's where the traditional media are there, right, as well. I mean, they are very active. They're actually quite well watched on YouTube, TikTok. We did some research and found that they're still some of the most watched videos, especially when it comes to Canadian politics and kind of event news as well.
Yeah, and I think people discount the amount that they form the base of. I think they're called stitches on TikTok, where you
Mm.
take somebody else's content and you add your own. So there's still the trigger to talk about a topic and the canvas, I guess, where a lot of these influencers paint their own stories onto. So we can't forget that role of generating that initial piece of news.
So personally, the way I look at my so what about this is it feels to me it's reminiscent, let's say, of the argument that the food and beverage producers had, or I used to work at a credit card company. The credit cards used to make is that consumers have to make good choices. So there is a personal responsibility. There's a buyer beware. So are you going to drink 2 to 4 liters of soda or pop every day and then you put on weight? Is that the responsibility of the soda for producing the product, or is that responsibility of the individual who consumed too much soda? I what I'm seeing is it seems like the social media platforms are kind of they want to absolve their accountability here, right? Because there's no win for them. So there's this thing. We've got a product. They are stopping a lot of the content moderation that's sort of going away. I honestly didn't see how that was going to be sustainable or feasible. There's just too much content out there. There is a bit of personal responsibility. I do think the education and that social responsibility doesn't go away completely, that the platforms and government need to educate, I think, especially young people. I think people like our age, we're Gen Xers, probably millennials as well, for the most part, have enough awareness to understand or see if they're heading down a rabbit hole or not. I think that younger people probably are a bit more naive, and that's where the education and awareness needs to be focused.
Well, I find, just talking to people in my circles that critical thinking is an issue that everybody has. There's just so much information out there to consume, and just as an individual, you cannot be expected to be able to sort out truth from fiction in every single situation, and that's why we're building our relationships with different influencers, because we're sort of offloading that thinking process from us to people that we trust. And as that's been changing, whereas we used to trust these institutions, these news institutions, it's now moving to these new emerging influencers. And I think part of the challenge is these influencers are new to the media. They're not reporters with 20 years of experience that have been trained by reporters with 60 years of experience. They're just kind of making it up as they go. I think we're going to see an increase in how effective these emerging voices are, and they're going to learn the trade, so to speak, and eventually uh, we're going to create new institutions on these new emerging platforms.
Yeah, and look, I think we all have to take responsibility for what we watch, and I know some people have created multiple profiles for themselves on different platforms, and some profiles it goes into sort of more of a liberal echo chamber. Other profiles go into a more right wing or conservative echo chamber, but they do it personally so that they are getting a diversity of voice. So they're proactively setting that up so that they know the algorithm is going to feed them down one rabbit hole or one angle down the other.
So that's interesting. They're doing this consciously.
You're
I want a
consciously
voice on the
doing,
left. I want a voice on
yeah,
the right. I don't want this mixed messaging within one user account.
exactly. They are actively sourcing it and leveraging the algorithm and the platforms as their channel to get that. And I think that more and more people are going to have to start doing that. I know I purposely will. If I realize I've been getting too much, content on one side of an argument, I will seek out the other side and then let the algorithm feed me more and more. So I understand a little bit deeper about that side of the argument. But again, that's because we spend all of our time here looking at narratives and influencers and who's trying to push and shape opinion. Not everyone's going to have that deeper understanding that you and I have because of the work we do. That's where the education and the awareness comes in, so that more people are going to be consuming from a place of education and experience. And again, you got to start young with that because the kids are getting onto the social media in their teens.
Sure.
Okay, well, I think that's a good wrap up at this point for our second episode. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for our listeners. We will, of course, put in the show notes some links to the data that we shared today. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. And we will see you for our next episode. We're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look into a particular topic, pipeline, something that definitely shifting perceptions here in Canada. They used to be terrible thing. Now there are saviors for the economy. We're going to share our own analysis on that one next time. So please watch our next episode. Thank you.
See you soon.